Building in Minecraft can be difficult and sometimes quite challenging, so here's a few tips on how you can improve your builds and become a better builder. In architecture, form refers to the shape or configuration of a building, and in art, it can be used to create illusions of depth and perspective. So here, I've gone ahead and I've started off with a simple stone house, and I'm going to create depth to it by adding more shape to the build. Just having a flat build is very boring to look at, and by introducing more variety in the shape of it, it sections off parts of the build, which is important because it shows the main components and volumes of the building. And after adding just these simple extensions, the building becomes much more interesting to look at. If you're finding it hard to come up with the right shape for your build, you could always start off with simple shapes like squares or rectangles and add more shapes to it. Alternatively, using a reference like a picture is a great way of planning out how you want your build to turn out, and in my opinion, it makes things way easier. Next, let's talk about coloring and texturing. In Minecraft, there are hundreds of blocks to choose from, so when building, it's important to think of blocks as colors instead of what they actually are, if that makes sense. Basically, the further you are from a block, the less texture you see, and instead see more color. An amazing builder called Snarple talks about this in much more detail, so if you want, go ahead and check him out, he's very cool. In this case, for this build, I'm replacing the stone with bone blocks because I want to have a yellowish off-white color for the main body of the build. I've made cutouts for the windows, and I've used mushroom blocks to act as a darker white color on the sides because using a darker color can add forced shadows. When texturing, it's important to try to imagine where the light would hit from, and I've tried to also mimic where moisture would enter the build, such as under the windows and corners, which gives it that rustic, worn out look to it. Doing this adds so much more depth and makes your build feel more 3D. Another thing to keep in mind is that lots of this process is trial and error, so don't expect this part to just be easy, it takes practice. Choosing blocks to build with can be difficult, so if you're having a hard time coming up with a palette, there are many websites such as block palettes, which I personally use, that give you tons of combinations of colors and blocks to choose from. Before I move on, I want to talk about gradients. Yes, you've all heard this word.
Gradient.
Gradients.
A nice gradient can really tie a build together. Having a smooth transition from one hue to another suggests depth, curvature, or even distance in a build. So if you're able to implement a gradient somewhere in your build, it can really make it look better. Arguably, the most time-consuming part when building is detailing. It's so essential to make a nice looking build, and you should try to incorporate your build's theme in the details you put. For example, because I'm building a sort of industrial style build, I'm going to include a few pipes running along both sides of the building with a few chimneys coming out of the roof. One thing I love to do is to put chiseled bookshelves behind scaffolding to make detailed windows. I also use trapdoors and glass panes to simulate overhangs for certain parts, again adding just a bit more depth. Detailing really just fixes all those empty parts of the build and makes it visually more interesting to look at. Because detailing isn't really straightforward, here's a few things I do when I detail my builds. Number one is that I use unconventional blocks. What I mean by this is that I use blocks you wouldn't find yourself using normally, such as hoppers or levers, blocks that have different shapes or different angles that I can use. Number two is that I try to make sure my details have a purpose. Try to convey a sort of function or story with the details you put in, otherwise they may just feel pointless. Number three is to try and balance out the amount of stuff you add. Adding too much or too little of detail can really affect how the build feels and sometimes can ruin the whole thing. So play around with differing amounts of detail and try to find the perfect balance. So now you've built a great looking build. Before I end this, I just want to say that everyone has their own way of building and that you should develop your own style. Also, there's no wrong way of building in Minecraft, just like art, it's completely subjective. Unless you build like this.